Yes, we'll see.
Oh, it's live.
Oh, I think we're live. Yay! Hello, everybody. Welcome to our AAPI Book Month panel, Asian Characters in Historical YA, hosted by Asian Author Alliance as part of a month-long virtual event to celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Deeba Zargarpur. I'll be moderating today. I'm an editor at Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers and Salam Reads, an imprint that centers Muslim main characters as the heroes of their own stories. I'm so excited to be moderating this wonderful and extremely important panel where our panelists will discuss their fantastic novels and the work that went into tackling the historical narrative. To kick off our discussion, I think it'd be great for everyone to just go around and introduce themselves and their books. Hana, if you want to go first.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hanna Alkaf, and I am the author of the historical fiction YA The Weight of Our Sky, which came out in February of 2019. Wow, I had to sort of catch myself for a minute because I just realized it's been more than a year since I did it. Yes, it came out in February of 2019, and it's about a young girl with OCD who is separated from her mother during the race riots of Kuala Lumpur in 1969.
Traci?
Yeah, okay, I'll go. Hi, I'm Traci Chee. I'm the author of We Are Not Free, a young adult historical about the Japanese American incarceration camps of World War II, loosely inspired by some of my family's own experiences from those camps.
Hi, my name is June Hur, and I'm the author of The Silence of Bones, and it's a YA historical mystery set in Chosun, Korea, 1800 specifically. And it's about a servant girl indentured to the police bureau, and she's tasked with assisting a young inspector with the murder of a noblewoman.
It's my turn?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was having I'm good now. Okay. I'm Stacey Lee. I'm the author of The Downstairs Girl, which just came out last year. And this one is about a girl in 1890 Atlanta, Georgia, who becomes the pseudonymous author, like the Dear Abby of the South. She secretly lives in the basement, and she starts to change notions of society and issues in society by her sometimes scandalous advice columns. So this is my fourth book, and yeah, I'll stop there.
So exciting. Discussion. Everyone's books sound fantastic, and if you guys haven't ordered them, you should, like, immediately. So I know, as I've gotten older, I think that I've really been drawn more to historical stories. I think, there's, as I'm trying to figure out, my own identity and just, moving forward towards life, I'm finding myself drawn more back into, my roots and the past. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask everybody is, before you started writing your stories, what was it that, drew you to the historical time period? I'd like to know a little bit about what really inspired you to write in the time period of your books.
I'll go first. Sorry, Traci.
No, you do it. You go first. I was waiting to be called on.
I started writing about 1969 in Malaysia because there's so little we're told about our own history in Malaysia. We don't like to talk about the things that are difficult. We don't like to talk about things like race or things like mental illness, which is what two things that my book deals with. There are just certain time periods that we are told so little about, and we're taught to just accept that that's what we are told, and not to question and not to be curious, because there's a certain danger in curiosity, as though if you start questioning more about your history, then another May 13th incident will happen. That's something that we've been told a lot. It's sort of held as a specter over our heads, like, oh, behave yourself, stay in line, do what we tell you, or another May 13th may happen. And so I just really wanted to make sure that we knew our own history, like we knew parts of our own history, because, like you said, how can you move forward if you don't know where you came from? And so I really wanted to write about the incident, and I really want to write about historical time periods in Malaysia specifically that we just don't know very much about. And we as Malaysians, I don't even mean we as in people in general, I just mean Malaysians. There's so little we know about our own history. There's so little we're told. So.
Okay, I'm gonna go now.
Yay!
For me, I was first kind of introduced to the concept of the incarceration when I was 12. And so like for 12 years of my life, I had no idea that this had happened to my family. And when I was 12, my grandfather, who was 16 when he was first incarcerated, was being awarded an honorary diploma from the San Francisco Unified School District because he would have graduated from one of their schools if not for if he hadn't been, forced out of his home and then sent to a barbed wire camp for 3 years. So they were doing this kind of way to honor and kind of recognize the past. And he was pleased about it, but he was also like quoted in the newspaper as saying, "Where are all the bleeding hearts in 1942?" And I was like, "But mommy, what's a bleeding heart?" Like I didn't know. And so she had to explain to me like a bleeding heart is like someone who cares about, other people, but it's got kind of this like this extra kind of derogatory meaning to it. And like, so I was trying to puzzle this out. And this was really my first introduction to what had happened to my family and more than 100,000 other people of Japanese ancestry in this country. This idea of anger and bitterness that my grandfather had been holding on to, like this kernel of emotion for so many years at that point. And as I wanted to become a writer and started pursuing this seriously, I knew I wanted to write something about it. And so finally in like 2016, it kind of all came together in like this confluence of inspiration events. And I figured out how to write that story. But yeah, 12 years old, it's been sitting with me for that many years.
Can I ask, Traci, is that something your grandfather spoke to you about, would share about?
No, he didn't talk to me about it. My grandma didn't talk to me about it until I explicitly asked. My step grandmother didn't talk about it. It was just like not a thing that people of that generation talked about. And I think there's like a lot wrapped up in there, like shame that they, allowed this to happen to them, even though they didn't really have a choice. And then like this idea of maybe wanting to leave it in the past. But luckily, when I started interviewing my relatives, they were really forthcoming. It seemed like they were finally ready to tell those stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this is a good time for me to share why I came into historical. Because like you, Traci, and I'm just going to show this book, Out on the Moon, which was my second historical. Thank you. This was really, I got the inspiration from family history, and that was something that they didn't share with me either, because I feel like there was a feeling of being ashamed of being a paper son and having to get into the country through other means because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for me, all my books have been really inspired, I think, by when my family came and my family struggles. So Out on the Moon, the one I showed you, is about the 1906 earthquake, and the earthquake had this funny silver lining of creating a loophole in the Exclusion Act because the fire destroyed so many birth records. And that was how my parents were able, or how my father was able to come into the country. And yeah, I think it's really interesting how a lot of this history is buried because of feelings of, just like shame maybe. And we don't want to bring, there's so much other things that we want to talk about. We're going to just sort of pretend that didn't happen. And then, me learning about it actually did open up these conversations, which I think is so awesome. So for all my history books, I think it's great when you can provoke discussions amongst young people and with their grandparents and people who have, been through it and seen through it. So that's how I come to write about history, just through family things. And this one, I'd not had any family members who lived in the South or came from the South. So for me, it was quite a surprise to find that there were Chinese people living in the South. And they came after Reconstruction to replace the field slaves. So I thought it would be really interesting to see what it would have been like living in the South as a Chinese person at the time. So that's how this book was inspired.
For me, I began writing about Korea specifically because like even before I wrote Korean historicals, I wrote British historicals. Since I was 12 years old, I wrote Pride and Prejudice fan fiction. And then I began writing my own original like Regency romances. So I was very well acquainted with historical fiction set in Britain. And I think I grew up with a very Eurocentric kind of reading taste. And, you know, my parents as well, they rarely, if ever, spoke about Korean history. And all of my relatives, most of my relatives live in Korea, so I had very little exposure to Korea's past, except through Korean drama. But then I think after years of getting rejected for my British historical, I just kind of wondered what other histories I could explore. You know, I looked into America, but I'm not American, so I'm like, I don't know how to write an American historical. And then I looked into Canadian, but I just couldn't relate somehow. And then finally, I kind of gave Korean history a try. I was just wondering, you know, why there were so few books set in like the Chosun period, which is a hugely popular period in Korean dramas, and yet I see so little of it represented in Western literature. And the majority of books about Korea is set in like the Japanese colonized Korea or like Korean immigrants, the immigration struggle. And I think those books are so important. But that was the only history I knew. And for me, as someone growing up with a family that still has like that resentment towards, like, for example, Japan, it was a bit uncomfortable for me to read books that explored that, just because it's like a wound that's still kind of not yet fully closed in Korea. Like there's still that tension in Korea, even till today. And so for me, when I read historical, part of me just wants to escape. But then because a lot of the Korean historicals just constantly reminded me of the things I'm still struggling with, I wanted to look for something else that was pre-colonization. And there were so few books. And so I finally kind of just looked up some scholarly articles on Korea's like the early 1900s and 1800s. And I was just so amazed by how complex it was. And back then, Korea was a hermit. It was nicknamed the Hermit Kingdom because their doors were closed to all of the West, and any kind of Western influence, like whether it was like the science, Western science or religion, anyone kind of holding that kind of knowledge would be executed by death. And so I found that tension between the East and the West so fascinating, both as a Korean and a Korean living in Canada. So that's why I wanted to explore that tension a bit by writing more about Korea.
I mean, those are all amazing explanations. I think definitely the thing that I'm really interested in expanding more on is really this idea of, like, you know, finding those roots and connections to these politically charged time periods and really not finding them, you know, in our lives with our families, you know, just not really feeling comfortable sharing like these very painful moments in history. But in your journey to write about these moments and feel that connection, what I'm really curious to know, like, what steps did you take during the drafting process? Did you start to write first and then research along the way, or did your process was the opposite, where you researched more about the time periods and then started to formulate the story around your research?
I'd like to jump in on this one. So I knew that I wanted to write this story, and I knew that my relatives who had lived through the camps were getting up there in age. And so I started interviewing them first because I wanted to see if I could get those stories before the people who lived them were gone. So I started that first, and then I started reading some of the fiction about the time, and then I dug into kind of the more academic research. I started reading primary sources from the time, newspapers, reports, and then kind of expanded by going to visit museums and going to visit the sites of the camps. And so I collected this kind of huge amount of information. And then I tried to kind of weave my way through like all of like these things that I could possibly talk about, but I had to narrow down into like the size of a book. And so having kind of this broader timeline really helped me to kind of like thread the needle of a narrative. And it's a narrative with like 14 points of view. So finding those 14 points of view. But having all of that research kind of beforehand really helped. And then I did it, as needed, as I would realize, oops, I didn't learn about that part yet, and then go look for it.
I love research, and I could research something forever and never actually write a book and be really happy, like just to continue doing research. But I used to be a journalist. So, and this was my first attempt at a novel. So I approached this a lot like I would have approached any long form feature that I was writing for like a magazine or something. So I started, like Traci, I started with interviews. Only finding people who are still alive who want to talk about the May 13th riots is actually really, really difficult. There's still such this idea of like that it's such a taboo to talk about race in Malaysia, and to talk about May 13th specifically feels like such a dangerous thing, such a sensitive thing, that it's actually really, really difficult to find people who are willing to talk about their experiences, because you can't quite get rid of this idea that you're not supposed to be talking about it. So that was the first step. Just finding people who are willing to talk to me about it was actually a really big deal. And then, like Traci did, I read every article I could find that was written both from inside and outside Malaysia, because you also have to understand that our media was pretty tightly controlled. And so the kind of things that were being written in the country by people who are local were different from the kinds of things that were being written by, say, foreign correspondents, right? So I had to find those two different sources. I had to find things that were written retroactively as well, because at the time, you might not have gotten the full picture, while they were trying to control the situation within the country. I read the government white paper on it. I read people who had lived, I read biographies of people who had lived through the time, read everything I could get my hands on. And then to get an idea of Malaysia in the 60s, like Kuala Lumpur in the 60s was a whole separate entity than Kuala Lumpur as it is now. I watched movies and I listened to the music of the time period. And then there's a whole other layer of research that has to be done about mental illness representation at the time, because mental illness in the 1960s would have been treated very differently than it is now. So I had to do that layer of research as well, look up, find experts who could tell me about that. So there was a lot of research that happened a good 6 months before I actually started writing anything. And then a lot of research that happened during the writing of the book as I figured out how much I didn't know about certain things. And then research that also happened after, just for me to make sure that I didn't misrepresent anything that I wrote then after I was done. So yeah, it was just constant research. And I love that there's a comment here that says how Ravenclaw all of these panelists are. It's true. It's true.
I guess I'll go. So for me, I had the idea to write in 2015. And then I think I researched for a year, not because I felt like I wanted to research for that long, but mainly because I was so scared to write about Korea. As a diaspora writer, I struggled with, wondering whether I had the right to write about Korea, and afraid that, Korean born and raised individuals might feel like I didn't have the right somehow because I wasn't raised in a Korean school and I didn't attend a Korean university. So I researched for a year just to gain a foundational knowledge of Korean history because I had close to zero. All I knew about Korea was based on what the little bits that I learned through media, through school when I stayed awake in Korea, because I used to go to high school in Korea, and also through my parents. But yeah, for a year I tried to build that foundational knowledge. For me, what was really important was trying to figure out the landscape of Korea, because I can't just make it up. Like I need to, hunt down like what roads there were, what the roads were called, where was the silk shop, where was the, so-and-so shop. So that's what I did for a year. And then when I began writing, a lot of, as Traci and Hana mentioned, like there's so many little bits and pieces of things that I still had to figure out. Oh my gosh. My screen turned off for a second. But yeah, so that's what I did. And what I really struggled with was not a lot of Korean resources are translated into English. Like there are enough, but when it comes to very niche details like the Tamo, which my book is focused on, and Tamos were female police investigators, and trying to learn more about their lifestyle, what they did, that was really tricky. So I'd have to look into Korean resources, and I'd spend hours just translating even a page, or maybe not a page, like an hour translating maybe 3 pages. Because while I'm fluent in Korean, like my Korean isn't at the level of like an academic researcher. And so it takes me a long time to translate. And Korean academic writers really love adding Chinese characters into their Korean. And so I'd spend more time translating the classical Chinese. So yeah, it was pretty it took a lot of time, but at the same time, I found it really rewarding. Like when you find that one information you're hunting for, it feels like it was like this treasure waiting for you to find. So researching is hard, but I really enjoy it at the same time. Yeah.
So I just love hearing everybody's stories because it makes me realize that I wasn't the only one in these cocoons. You get so wrapped up in research, and for a good chunk of months, your friends don't hear from you and wonder what happened to you. And it's because you're in the research thing. And like all of you said, yeah, this takes months to sometimes years to get through all this stuff. One of the things that I did, in addition to all the things that you find yourself doing, one of the things that I did was, since I didn't have people who had lived through it still living, I went to the Stanford Library. I'm lucky I lived close enough to it. And I went into the bowels of the library, and that's where they keep the microfiche for all the newspapers published in the 1800s. So I spent a good few weeks reading about a year's worth of papers in 1890. And it's very dim down there. I don't know why they don't make the lights better. It was Halloween at the time, so there were all these horror posters on the wall. It was a very kind of weird, scary place to be. But I felt like that was necessary to sort of get the tenor of, what society was like at that time, and the way they chose to speak, attitudes towards the races. I knew quite a bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act from my research on my other novels. What I was weaker in was the history of Chinese African-American relations in the South. As you can imagine, there was not a lot written about that. And so it was difficult to find books on Chinese in the South, but also their relationship with other races. And I found that I had to spend a lot of time looking for those resources. before being able to do the research. So that was one of the things that I found. But the more you dig, the more you look, you keep following footnotes, and you eventually discover what you need. So when I still get emails from people asking me how I found these resources. They didn't know Chinese were in the South. And so I'm sort of compiling a list for anybody who's interested. Yeah.
I mean, those are all amazing answers. Definitely. Like, this is why I'm happy to be an editor, because I can read all of the amazing work that went into crafting the story. I definitely wanted to touch upon a little bit about what you said about the racial tensions and being able to kind of find the balance between the research and the story. I know that especially here in America, like, many people here like have this idea of Asia being a singular monolith, and but we know that within even a single country there are so many different ethnic groups, religious beliefs, viewpoints on mental health, sexuality, and gender. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose to tackle some of those points in your stories, how you chose to, I guess, touch upon certain sensitive topics in how you presented them in your stories, or how they manifested themselves within the characters? Hannah, if you want to go. Or
I'll start again. I really glommed onto this idea of we are not a monolith. As I was writing We Are Not Free, because I feel like in the US, this is like a small little pocket of history that people don't know about it, or if they know, if they've heard of it, they've only heard of it kind of in passing, maybe in like a paragraph in one of their history textbooks. And so I found that kind of a lot of the impressions about Japanese Americans in World War II were like of the stereotypical like noble, suffering Japanese person. And that is a story that is a way that some people reacted to the incarceration. But especially because like I heard that anger in my grandpa's quote from when I was 12, like I knew that there were other reactions to the incarceration. Not everyone just kind of took it and suffered quietly, right? People were outspoken, they resisted, they became activists. People just tried to live their lives, right? They were teenagers at the time. And so they just, wanted to go to dances and like hang out with their friends and like sneak some sake from like their grandpa's sake still, And so like that capturing kind of this multifaceted nature of just this one group from San Francisco was part of my project. And one of the reasons I chose to do 14 points of view, to show like, look, not everyone was the same. And a lot of it depended on kind of where they lived before the incarceration and how well off their family was. My step-grandfather was very poor when his family was incarcerated. And so when they went into the temporary detention centers, he was getting 3 meals a day, and that was an improvement on before. And so like, that's not something like to think of like, oh, it's an improvement. Or like my step-grandmother, she wanted to learn to play the piano, and in the camp, they had a piano that she could practice on. And so kind of telling like these other things that don't fit into the single story of like noble Japanese suffering was really, really important to me. I don't know if I answered the question, but hopefully that gives other people a way to
it was still a really great answer.
Okay. It was a great answer, definitely.
I sort of half forgotten what the question is, but I'm going to jump off what you just said and pretend that I'm asking the same question. This idea of we are not a monolith is really a really tough one for me to grapple with, because even in Malaysia, we're not a monolith. Not all Malaysians are the same. We're a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, right? But there is so little representation for us in Kidlit and in YA. specifically, that I'm very aware that being a Malaysian writer means I'm standing in for a lot of people's experiences, even though I'm only one part of the Malaysian, patchwork. So it feels like a lot of pressure to represent that many people with just my own experience, because I'm writing from the point of view of a Malay Muslim girl. But what I really wanted to do was, the other thing I really wanted to do in this story was explore this intersection between culture and faith and mental illness, which is a thing that I didn't really see explored. A lot of the writing in YA, a lot of YA in general is set in the West. There's none set in Malaysia. And so you learn to see yourself in characters that don't look like you. But the Western experience of mental illness is very different from the Southeast Asian or Asian experience of mental illness, particularly if you're not living in the West. And so much of that has to do with this intersection of culture and faith. And so I really wanted to write this intersection specifically into my book. And I really wanted to make sure that that was something that was explored accurately and sensitively. So yeah, this idea of we are not a monolith, it's something that I think about a lot, because we aren't, even in a single country, we aren't. But I'm very aware that as a Malaysian YA author, that I have to represent Malaysians and not just my specific experience of being Malay and Muslim in Malaysia. So it's a rough thing to grapple with, I think.
Yeah, we are not a monolith. And one thing that I'm always trying to keep in mind when I choose my story matter and what to write about is I do want to show those stories that you would never hear about, those stories that are just not covered because for whatever reason, publishers, society think that, stories of Chinese girls historically should just be the immigrant story or whatever. So I feel like I want to shed light in those unseen corners where we don't expect to see an Asian person, such as in the gold rush or on the Oregon Trail or in Atlanta, Georgia. I think, Deeba, your original question was about how did we handle sort of sensitive topics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, I think those issues we shouldn't shy away from. We don't have to, be confrontational about it, I guess. No one wants to be preached at. But in the Downstairs Girl, at least, Miss Sweetie is the name of the advice column that my protagonist writes through. And every other chapter, every few chapters, there's an advice, a letter written to Dear Miss Sweetie that she answers. And her tone is often irreverent, but she's tackling some basic truths. And I feel like that's sort of how I approach my own life and things. I don't shy away from wrestling with these deeper issues, but I always try to maintain a sense of, not humor, but remembering that it's not the end of the world, but it's important to be, addressed, but I'm not going to shove it down your throat. And I feel like this is how Dear Miss Sweetie approaches these issues, brings them up, offers an opinion, and it's up to you whether, to form your own opinions about it. So that's how I handled issues of suffrage, issues of Jim Crow laws, segregation, all that. They say that nothing is off limits in YA. It's a matter of how you handle it and the context you give it. So I won't shy away from it, but I will try to give it to you in a way that is appropriate to the time period and in a way that I think is digestible.
For me, when I think of the Asian female stereotype, it's often that subservient, quiet, nice Asian girl. And so when I was researching into Korea, it was interesting because I could see where like that assumption would be made, because in Korea, for example, it was very steeped in Confucianism, and I carry very Confucian values as well. I didn't know that, but through researching, I realized I do have Confucian values. But one of the problematic sides of Confucianism during the Joseon period was that it was very gender segregated, where men and women weren't allowed to interact. Women were confined within their inner sphere, and men, owned the public sphere. And women were expected to bear children, obviously get married, cook, be kind to the in-laws. And one of the grounds for divorce was if a woman talked too much, you were allowed to divorce your wife. And so even though that is a historical fact, that doesn't mean, East Asian, particularly Korean women, are subservient and quiet and, the typical nice girl. And while I was researching, what I found so fascinating was, like I mentioned before, the role of the tamo, which were female police officers. They were created not because Korea was feminist back then, but because men were not allowed to interrogate noble women or even question women of lower class. They just were not allowed to interact with women who are not related to them. They weren't even able to examine them if, female corpses like that. They had to use their female servants in order to do the work that they were not able to do. So basically, these female police officers were created because of a very gender segregated and patriarchal society. And yet you see these women taking these roles that, men imposed on them and using it to, express their own agency. And for my heroine, it's her taking over the investigation, but in a secretive way. And so for me, when it comes to the idea of the stereotype of the quiet, the nice East Asian girl, I don't know what other stereotypes outside there. I just know what is personal to me. Women throughout history have always been known to subvert these roles that they're kind of restricted within. And so that was one of the things that I really wanted to show with my book. And Deeba, you kind of mentioned also how we deal with sensitive issues. And the historical backdrop my book revolves around is when a fugitive Catholic priest from China smuggles himself into Korea, and there's like this underground movement of Catholicism going on in Korea, which was back then, like, if you have any connection to Western science or religion or any kind of teachings, you are executed. And so for me, as a Korean, but also a Christian who knows how problematic religion has been, it was very important for me to kind of examine that tension where, Christianity was kind of spreading illegally throughout Korea. And yet everyone, like even back then, everyone knew that with Catholicism came the possibility of colonization. And so it was a strange tension where the government wanted to eradicate Catholicism because they were afraid of what it might do to the tradition. And there was also other complicated political reasons for how problematic Catholicism was back then. And yet for Korea, Catholicism was a very kind of homegrown kind of movement, because there were no Westerners spreading Catholicism. So kind of the native Koreans kind of just took that religion and worked with it however they wanted to, in isolation from the West. So when I was writing this book, like, I had to be really careful on not taking sides. And for me, one of the ways that I did that was writing a heroine who was Buddhist and kind of influenced through my own Buddhist family members. And for me, it was important for her to remain Buddhist because I didn't want her to like convert, because I feel like that gives off the most, problematic messaging. So she stays Buddhist, and I just wanted to capture history, like just to acknowledge the humanity of both sides. Like, I understood why there was persecution going on. Like, I understood why, the government was afraid, but I also understood, the side of other Native Koreans who were just fascinated by this, Western teaching. So yeah, I approached it more from a historical standpoint, where I don't want to preach, but I just want to kind of depict this fascinating tension, because back then, Catholicism was banned, and yet I'm a Korean Christian, and I just found that fascinating. So I just wanted to capture that without taking sides. But yeah, I could go on, but I'll stop there.
No, I mean, that was amazing. I think you definitely, in your book, handled that very elegantly. I know when I started reading, it just drew me in the way that you started to lure the reader in, and then we start to delve deeper into the time period, and the way that you introduce Catholicism and you introduce all of these ideas, especially with the heroine, of just like all of these rules for women in the day, and yet she is the only one who, I mean, this isn't a spoiler or anything, but she literally shoots a tiger. She's so brave, and I want to, before I ask this last question, I just want to tell everybody in the audience that we are reaching the 15-minute mark. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists, now is the time to type those questions in little chat boxes. But definitely, I guess what I wanted to ask next is, after learning all of the fascinating history in your books, what was the balance like blending the history with fiction? How many creative liberties did you take in crafting the narrative in your books? So was there any give or take? Is there anything that you felt perhaps you had felt that you needed to shift or alter in the narrative?
I tried very hard to stick as close as possible to the historical facts that happened during the 13th May riots, only because 1969, we're not that far away from it. When my book came out last year, it was the 50th anniversary of the riots. And that's not in any way far from removed from us. 50 years is nothing. So there are people still alive right now who lived through those, who survived those riots, who had family members survive those riots, or who didn't survive those riots. And it was very important to me that that topic was dealt with sensitively, and that I showed respect to the memories of the people who lived through it and who were open-hearted enough to share their stories with me. I felt a real responsibility to make sure that I was representing their experiences and their memories as accurately as possible when it came to the fact. Really, the liberties that I took are more in language. So there's stuff that's used in there that's ahistorical, like people give high fives and stuff. But it's because I wanted it to be more approachable to a younger audience, especially considering that it's a setting that's far removed from what a lot of people may be used to. 1969 in Malaysia doesn't really cross many people's radars. When you talk about representation in general, really, Malaysia is not really a place that people think about. Southeast Asian representation is already so tiny as it is. In the kidlit sphere, in the Western kidlit sphere. And so when you talk about Malaysia, I don't think many people think about it at all. So I just really wanted to make sure that this part of our history was represented. As June says, I don't necessarily want to tell you who's wrong and who's right and whose side you should be on. Because I think when you're stuck in the middle of a huge event like a race riot, it's such a seminal event for us, I don't think you're thinking about that. Most people, I think we're thinking about just surviving and getting through it. And I don't necessarily want to preach at people and be like, this is wrong and this is right. This is what happened. This is what people lived through. And it's up to you to draw your own conclusions from that. But yeah, that's how I went about it. So.
For me, I tried to stick, like Hana said, as close to the history as possible. And I found actually that was really easy because the history was so fascinating and I could get like so much interesting story out of it. But there were times when I would bend the timeline a little bit. Like there's a shooting that happened in one of the camps and it happened in April. And then according to the story, I needed it to happen in February. So I just kind of bumped it up. I would just bend the timeline a little, but in a way that I hoped still felt true. And like Hana said, respectful to the history. There was, I think one of the bigger timeline bends I did was I moved a movie from 1945 to 1944. And the reason I did this is because my grandfather in 1945 had been drafted into the army. He was in basic training. He got one of his very rare weekend passes, apparently. He was not a great soldier. And so he went to go see this movie, Blood on the Sun, which is a kind of a propaganda film about kind of an American journalist in Tokyo, and he uncovers like this plot by the Japanese government to do something nefarious, and it's not great. I watched as much as I could stomach before I had to turn it off. But my grandpa writes in a letter to my grandmother, I saw this movie. It was such a propaganda film. I could hear people hissing slurs around like at the screen as I was watching it. And I was just like, this is a thing too good not to include, right? This is a little kind of pocket of history. So I moved that up to 1944 and I gave that moment of like sitting in a theater and having all of these white people around him kind of whispering as he is in training to defend this country about kind of what a dirty J word these people are. So this like things that felt true and felt respectful to the history, I felt okay in bending a little bit.
I mean, same as Hana and Traci. Miss Sweetie herself, Jo, my heroine, is taking a liberty. Most of the Chinese who came to the South were men. It was a bachelor society. So putting a woman there was definitely taking a liberty. I do believe in trying to stick as much to historical fact as possible. But like Traci, I did have to bend some timelines because, to make the story all fit the way you want it to, sometimes things have to be bent. Streetcar segregation happened in 1891, and the book takes place in 1890. I really wanted to include that detail, especially since it was so important to represent how Chinese fit into society. When you have a segregated streetcar, black at the back and white in the front, where do Chinese people fit on the streetcar? So I wanted her to really wrestle with that issue. So I moved that up a little. I had to set the story in 1890 for other reasons, and I would definitely be interested in hearing from these other writers at some point how you decide to choose your specific date, which I find always tricky. So anyways, I do take liberties with timelines and these are very weighty decisions, as I can see Traci's decision was too. These are decisions we weigh and wrestle with, and ultimately, that's what makes a story when you've really thought about it, and that's what makes it work. We make it work.
For me, so
Oh no, I think June is frozen.
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. You just froze.
Oh, okay. So I was saying, so I chose 1800 specifically because 1801 was when the Queen Regent kind of mandated that this policy where every five unit of houses, if there's a Catholic within it and they're not kind of exposed, then everyone within that 5 unit of houses ends up getting persecuted. And so it became this system of like, you know, you better snitch on this person or else 5 households will end up getting executed or banished or beaten or whatever. And so based on that, I took the liberty of creating a mystery where, well, this isn't spoilers, but basically you find out very early on in the book that, you know, people are getting killed because family members are so terrified of, you know, the repercussion of an individual being persecuted for their faith. And so that happens in 1801. But then I took the liberty of, you know, the people kind of hearing rumors of this policy coming later on in the year. So I kind of, you know, just played around with the what if game, like, you know, what if people heard rumors that this might happen? And with the mystery itself, I take history and then I ask myself, you know, what if this historical event, you know, what in this historical event would influence someone to commit murder? And in my book, there are historical figures. And that was a bit tricky because, you know, like I can't take too much liberty because they were actually, you know, real life people in the past. So what I did was, you know, I'd read up on their life, you know, and trying to figure out what kind of person they were. And then if I do write about them, I'd ask myself, you know, if they were in this situation, you know, what would they do? What would they say? But I kind of limit their presence in my book because I, as a diaspora writer, like there's a fear in me where it's like, you know, like what if a relative of this individual is actually like, you know, knows the character and is like, you know, my great grandmother never said that or would do that. So yeah, I just try to limit their presence. But yeah.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that's always so tricky is when you include actual real people in your work, and it's so hard because you don't want to misportray them at the same time, but you also want to keep the really authentic. Definitely. Mm-hmm. I mean, I love all of that. We are running a little bit behind. I think we have time though to answer some questions from the live comments. I don't know who picks them. Here we go. I don't know if you guys have spoken on this yet, but how do you go about creating your characters? How much of yourselves do you put in them, if at all? Who wants to go?
For me, there is a lot of myself in Melati, who is my main character. She's a 16-year-old Malay Muslim girl with what we know to be OCD. But she believes to be a jinn holding her mind and her body hostage, because that's what would have been fitting with what Muslims in Malaysia believed at the time, and in fact now. And there's a lot of myself in Melati in so many ways that it makes me uncomfortable to tell people exactly which parts, because it makes me feel so exposed and so vulnerable. I don't necessarily want you to know exactly which bits come from me and which bits are made up or are composites of research and stories from other people. But I think every character you write, every main character you write, does tend to have a piece of yourself in that character, or at least that's how it is for me. And Melati in particular is very much, there's a lot of myself in her, in so much so that people telling me they're reading the book is sort of terrifying because it feels like they're reading me. So yeah, there is a lot of myself in my main character.
I have heard that for writers' first books, that's who they put themselves in the most for the first books, and I felt that way for me. And then the other books, yeah, they're naturally have to have a bit of the author in them. But I don't know if this is just me, but my characters always start out just as like a big mush. they don't really get defined until plot happens, and then I'm able to refine them a little more. Miss Sweetie became more sassy as the book went along, but at the beginning she was just sort of a shapeless blob. So I have an idea of what I want her to be, but getting her there is definitely something I work on through the whole editing cycle of the book.
For me, with 14 main characters and kind of a chapter for each of them, I feel like some are more like me than others. And the way I kind of chose what their personalities would be was by what situation they were in. I used this kind of ensemble cast to explore different aspects of the incarceration. So one is about this very controversial loyalty questionnaire that was administered a year after they were already all incarcerated. And like, so I gave that chapter to someone who's just angry. Like, he sees these injustices in the world and he wants to fight them. Like, he would go swinging at like the president of the United States in 1943 if he had the chance. And so like that gave me like the opportunity to really dig into like, why was this so terrible? Like, why was it so divisive? How did people feel about it? But then there are other chapters where I have this guy in a war situation. He's in the European theater, and he is very, very, very unlike me. He's a thief. He's naturally charming. Like, he is fun. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but everybody likes him anyway. And so like getting to write like this character who's so full of life and joy kind of in that situation, this very dire situation in World War II was really fun also. So like, I guess no, he's really nothing like me. So being able to kind of sprinkle these characters and have them dictated by kind of whatever situation they were in to bring out kind of the most tension and like compellingness was really how I did that one.
So for me, I base create characters based on what I struggle with. So for me, my parents, I didn't live with my parents from my teen onwards because they live in Korea, and my siblings and I decided to come live in Canada. And so I've grown up with like a sense of homesickness and like wondering, who am I when the people who love me the most aren't with me? And just a sense of, I guess, loneliness because, I love my parents, but I'm not with them. And so I kind of create characters based on that personal struggle that I want to express through my books. And there are some types of characteristics that might not be suitable for this kind of struggle, and so I ended up creating, like, for example, Sol, who's much more of a sweeter, kind of naive and very loyal girl. And then for Inspector Han, he kind of takes on my existential angst, and he becomes this like very mean, rugged, haunted, brooding guy. And so yeah, I mold characters based on personal struggles, because I feel like with struggles, like when it comes to like loneliness and homesickness, like yes, a super extroverted social butterfly would work, but then I felt like a quieter, softer girl might, just be more like aesthetically, it might fit a bit more. But yeah.
That's great. Our next question. Can you share some interesting facts you learned while researching that didn't make it into your books? Oh, that's a good one.
Well, I read a lot of advice columns. So mine is more of a lighter response, but I read all these home remedies for balding and all the weird things that people would do to, overcome their personal problems. And then it occurred to me that we're still sort of doing that. So maybe that's not so ridiculous, but yeah, I guess I got to learn all the weird remedies people would use. There was a lot of opiums used for different things. And I thought that was fascinating. I didn't get to put all of those things in my book. I think it would have been fun too, but there was just too much. Yeah.
For me, most of the things that didn't make it in were family stories. There's some things I didn't put in there, and one of my favorites is I got to dig into my grandma's old steamer trunks, and she had like stacks and stacks and stacks. She had a lot of boyfriends, I am pretty sure, because she had just stacks and stacks and stacks of these letters. And eventually, like from 1945, after my grandfather was drafted into the war on, most of them are from Grandpa. But like his very first letter to her, he's just left for basic training, and he says, "Margaret, I just wanted to thank you. I just wanted to make sure you got the chocolates that my little brother dropped off, but they mean nothing. We're just friends. You know how people like to talk. It's like it's nothing." And so like it starts like this, and then over the course of the next 3 months, he starts like writing to her, sometimes like twice a day, like 13-page letters. And he's like, "I know I don't really have anything to say, but it's the thought that like it's the act of writing that counts. And I want to keep writing to you. And I really like getting your letters." And like at one point he changes his ink because the color of the ink like means something, like green apparently means love. And so it gets to a point where he finally, like 3 months in, he's getting ready to go back to camp to help his parents move back to San Francisco because the exclusion order has been lifted. And he's like, "All right, Margaret, I'll admit it. I like you an awful lot." And like, I feel like I got to see my grandparents fall in love. And this is just one of the most precious things from my research, because if I hadn't gone looking for it, I would have never known. And if I could throw a fact in there, it's that they called kissing, apparently, back in the day, a strawberry sundae. He's like, "So-and-so gave so-and-so a strawberry sundae in New York."
That's so cute.
That's so adorable.
Can I petition to have Traci do a dramatic reread of all her grandfather's letters?
Yes.
Special, but that needs to happen immediately.
Just do an hour live on the Asian Author Alliance, like YouTube.
Bonus content.
These letters here, like,
I have one dude voice, and it's that. So
I have no fun stories to share because I wrote about a race riot and there was nothing really that fun going on. So all the things that I learned that didn't really get woven into the story are just even more violent things. So for example, on the day that the riots happened, from about 6 p.m., from about 8 p.m. onwards, there was a shoot to kill order for people who were not adhering to the rules of curfew. And so there was there were just a lot of dead bodies. It's a really depressing way to end these fun anecdotes. I'm so sorry.
How do you
Sundays
through all this?
I don't have a fun one either.
strawberry Sundays to like, and by the way, there were way more dead bodies than I really wrote into this book. I'm so sorry. But basically from 8 p.m. onwards, there was a shoot to kill order. So earlier in the day on 13th of May, a lot of the people who were coming into the hospital with wounds had wounds consistent with a riot. So stab wounds and things like that, like head wounds, gashes. But later on, as the night progressed, there were a lot more wounds that were consistent with being shot. Like there were wounds that were sustained from gunshots. And the thing that I don't really talk about, I hint at, but I don't really talk about, is that because there a lot of the armed forces in Malaysia, they're mostly made up of Malay people. Later on in the night, the death toll actually consisted more of non-Malays. So that's why there's such a disproportionate, if you look at the breakdown of the death toll from the 13th May incident, there's a disproportionate amount of Malays versus non-Malays, and that's why. So that was a fun way to answer that question. I'm so sorry. Traci, you should have ended with Traci. I shouldn't have said anything.
Don't worry, mine is not any much happier. So for mine, the one that I kind of left out, which I found, I was so fascinated by this event, but I couldn't write about it because it wouldn't fit into my book. But it was about the Silk Letter. Basically, this Korean Catholic named Hwang Sa-yong, so this was during the persecution, like hundreds of Catholics are getting executed, beheaded, sent into exile, beaten, the police are trying to force the Koreans to apostatize. And so Hwang Sa-yong, he goes into hiding and he writes on a silk letter, basically a plea to the Catholic bishop in China to send Western military forces to invade Korea to save his Catholic brethren and sisters. And I was just like, and so this letter basically was a depiction of how torn I was reading it, because it's like, on one side you have, fellow family members, friends getting killed, but on the other side there's this guy asking for military intervention. And so it's like, giving up traditional Korea up for your own faith. And so so when I read this letter, I think that was what inspired that interest in me to explore that tension. And I didn't come up with any answers. I don't know who was right or who was wrong. In the end, I think both sides were very heartbroken. And so, that's how I'm ending it up with heartbroken.
Oh, I think we have last question now. Okay. Where is it? Here we go. 2 questions. What are some of your favorite books? Who are authors that your stories and or your writing draw inspiration from or feel influenced by? Great question.
Stacey Lee. Stacey Lee is amazing, and her books are amazing.
Stacey Lee.
I have your book right here.
I feel like if you ask anybody who's writing Asian historical fiction who they're influenced by, it's going to be Stacey Lee.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I feel like, we need more. I'm always telling people, write historical. Come on, write historical.
We always want it.
Not enough. So I'm happy. I'm so happy to see all of these authors doing this. I love it, and we need more. So thanks for that.
I can also add 2 books that really stuck with me from when I was a kid. They're a bit younger than middle grade YA. Were The Year of the Boar and Jackie Robinson by Betty Bao Lord. And then I also read The Best Bad Thing by Yoshiko Uchida. And one was kind of about Chinese immigrant history into the Americas, and one was about the Japanese immigrant experience into the Americas. And I'm both Chinese and Japanese American. So reading these in 2nd, 3rd grade was really formative for me. I didn't even realize it until maybe last year. But seeing characters in books grapple with their Chineseness and their Americanness, or their Japaneseness and their Americanness, really helped to kind of solidify my identity as both and all of these things when I was a lot younger. And so those 2 were super influential for me.
I think for me, it's difficult to be able to say that there were things in my childhood that resonated in the same way, because as I said, it was really hard to find any sort of representation in mainstream English kid lit that really reflected who I was and my identities. And when you're when that happens, you learn the trick. I think all of us learn this trick of finding ourselves, bits and pieces of ourselves in characters that don't really look like us. because that's what you're forced to do. You've never seen a character that looked like you. And so we have these conversations about windows and mirrors a lot in Kidlit. And I go to schools and they ask me, I give this presentation and they ask me, you know, when was the first time you saw a mirror, which was a little bit of what Traci was talking about. And I have to tell a lot of people that a lot of the time, if we're talking about mainstream English Kidlit, a lot of the time, I have to tell them that I had to make my own mirror to see myself. And so when you talk about, you know, what kind of authors inspired me in terms of historical fiction, that this is why I say Stacey, and this is why, like, all the people who are here, like Traci's books and things, it's because I don't really get to see anybody doing that in Kidlit for me, for my people, for my country, for a really, really long time until I wrote my book. So yeah, sometimes you have to do the work of making your own mirror.
I agree.
Yeah. That's definitely a really powerful ending note, I think. I feel like what Hana said it's really so true. It's like, especially now, I feel like we need to create our mirrors in order to see ourselves. And in children's publishing, I'm very, very hopeful and very, very optimistic, because I do see that there are more and more publishers who are taking the time to acquire our stories and give them that mainstream outlet that they deserve. And I think that in the next 10 years in children's publishing, I'm very hopeful to see kind of like the landscape change in a more positive and inclusive way. I think that's all that we have for our questions, though. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was a lovely discussion. I learned so much, and I think I could talk forever or listen forever about all the history and all the research that went into all of your books. Definitely, everybody check out Asian Author Alliance to learn more about AAPI Book Month panels and learn about each of the panelists' books. There are more panels coming up. Actually, there's a panel happening right now, right after this one, called Romance and Boss Babes with Ms. Sharma and Alicia Wright. If you guys can hop in, I advise doing that. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.